All right. Good morning, everyone. So Andy's been here since Sunday. So Andy has only had these few days of exposure to South Africa. His last time was in 2010 during the Lausanne conference, and I think all he saw was the inside of the International Convention Center and Table Mountain in the distance. So Andy, give me 3 highlights of your exposure to South Africa or the Western Cape in this last week.
Oh, man. The food, greatly, I didn't have low expectations, but the food has been incredible. The beauty of the land. I really, when I was here the one time before, I really was just in the city, I think. And just seeing this extraordinary place that you all call home, just from its beauty. And what would be number 3? There is a kind of welcome in almost every face you meet in a restaurant or, I don't know, at a shop. It's welcoming compared to maybe some places I go. Maybe in my own country. No, it's been delightful. Maybe it's because people know I'm not from here, and so they're welcoming to me, and they're not welcoming to you. But to me, it's been incredibly friendly and wonderful.
Maybe they've been watching TV and they're feeling compassionate.
It is possible.
Well, I think everybody here says welcome, right? A warm South African welcome to Andy. So Andy, to riff off of what Yuri was, when he was introducing us, he referred to the Big Change podcast, which Zawani's been hosting, and I've been on, you've been a guest on that. In a way, a lot of what we're here to talk about today is how we as Christians contribute to significant change in our context. Now, for some in the room today, that may be, we're just interested in seeing change in our family. We're just interested in seeing change in our local church or local community. Others have a bigger vision. And I want to hark back to an experience I had when I first came to South Africa. It was 1998, so 4 years after the end of apartheid. And as Yuri said, I used to work with African Enterprise. And I remember chatting with some colleagues over coffee and saying to them, what was it like in the midst of that journey where everything is, the system remains. It hasn't changed. It's still there. And yet you believe it shouldn't be. You believe it should change. What was it like to be in that journey at that time? And I remember one of the colleagues saying to me, Jonathan, we all believed apartheid had to end one day. It had to come to its end because it was a system with failure built into it. But none of us believed it would end in our lifetime. None of us believed that. They're all working for it, but they didn't believe it ended in their lifetime, and it did. And Andy was asking me on the way in, how many folk here are interested in that scale of change versus, smaller scales of change, and they're all legitimate scales of change. And I said, I actually don't know. But we're here to talk about all of it. We're here to talk about the change of a nation as well as the change of a heart. And so to kick things off, I want to talk about the fact that all change, whether it's the change of an individual, whether it's the change of the things within ourselves that we don't like, or whether it's the changes that we long to see in a country like South Africa, which has so much potential and yet so much history that is broken, that's powerful stuff that we want to see happen. And I think there's an instinct that we have as human beings, but also as Christians, is that powerful change requires power. It requires access to power of one kind or another. And that sets up a certain set of problems for us, I think, as Christians. So I think we're here to talk about that. And Andy, I think maybe let's start with that larger frame that we were chatting about in the car today, about impact and the 3 sort of dimensions of power that we long for.
Right. So, where do you get the power to change the world? I'm thinking, just to set this up, about what it would have been like to live in the province, I guess, of Judea in the 1st century AD, or the 1st century of the Common Era. when you are actually seeing massive change happen in the world at a very rapid rate, as the first emperor, Augustus Caesar, consolidates his power and spreads it through, for all practical purposes, the whole world. And he is so effective at what he does that by his about 45th birthday, because he's fortunate, by virtue of killing off most of his family members, he has a long reign as emperor. So he kills off all of his competitors, including many of his family. And so he ends up having, I think, 30 or so years where he reigns as emperor. It's quite long for a Roman emperor, it turns out. And by the middle of that reign, way over in Turkey, what's present-day Turkey, people are erecting placards, or a stone with engraved kind of celebration of the birthday of the god, or the divine Augustus, the divine son of God, who has brought peace to the whole world. And it said this was the beginning of the good news for the whole world when Augustus Caesar was born. And already, all across this vast territory, people are saying, this guy has changed the world. So what did Caesar have going for him? Well, there's basically three resources that if you have them, you can make quite dramatic and quite sudden change. And the first is the power of the state to coerce. So Max Weber, the sociologist, would say that what states do is claim for themselves the legitimate right to coerce, to make you do something, at the point of a gun if necessary, often through law, which doesn't require the gun to show up, but the gun is always there in the background. And the state can make you do things you don't want to do by law. So if you have that kind of power, you can change the world very quickly, get other people to do things they would not do otherwise. The problem with coercion is that there are only a few things you can make people do with the threat of force. So it's limited. It doesn't generate a lot of creativity. It's very hard to be creative, actually, under the, if you're ever faced with a judge or in a trial court, unless you're very, very well trained as an attorney or a lawyer, you will not be very creative in that moment. You'll be barely able to get the words out. But there's another kind of power that can compel a kind of creative action in the world, and that's money. If you have enough money and you can pay people and give them kind of the running room to express really their image bearing as image bearers of the creative God, they will absolutely start doing amazing things. So power of the state to coerce, power of money to kind of open up space for creative action. And then I think there's a third thing, which is the power of charisma to fascinate. The power that certain people have. Beyonce was mentioned. If Beyonce walked into this room, Jonathan, you and I, for as compelling as this conversation is, all the attention would get diverted, right? Because a ripple would go through the room. That's Beyonce, that's Beyonce. Because she has a kind of charisma that is just magnetic, and some people have it. Augustus Caesar had all three of these. So he's the emperor, he controls this vast military and police apparatus, same thing in his world. He literally mints the money, and on the money he puts his face, which if you lived in Judea is the only face you would ever see, because the Jewish people, obeying the second commandment, didn't make images of human beings. So literally the only representation of the human face you ever see was Caesar's face on Caesar's coins, handed out primarily to pay the Caesar's soldiers. And when you've got all three, you can change the world. It is interesting that there is another person who we come to think of as the divine son, who is living in the exact same time, and he has none of those. He does not have the power of the state at his command. In fact, he ends up a victim of the power of the state. He doesn't ever seem to have really depended on money. He certainly didn't have a lot of it. He entrusted the care of the money, apparently, John tells us, to one of the least reliable disciples. So it seems like he didn't. There's a moment when they ask him about paying the tax, right? And Jesus has to say, well, does anyone have one of those coins? And then when they bring it, he's like, who is this on the coin? Which is a crazy question. Whose face is this? Everyone, there's only one answer to that question. Everyone knows whose face is it. And Jesus acts like he's never even seen a coin. And his face has never been we have many, many representations of Jesus from the Christian tradition, but none of them are a likeness of Jesus because his face was never turned into an image. And Isaiah says that if he walked into this room, he would have no form that we would desire him, no comeliness that we would be attracted to him. We would not even probably notice. And that's the kind of charismatic presence or not that Jesus, I think in a way had. Though as he started to teach and as he started to heal, he had some of it, but nothing compared to Caesar. So you kind of have two ways to think about how change happens. Does it happen through getting enough power in the form of state, money, or charisma? And by the way, these have names. There are gods associated with these. Mars, Mammon, and Eros are the gods, the false gods that attach themselves to these. Or is there another way? So that, I don't know if that's quite what you were looking for, but that's how I think about these things.
Absolutely. And I think for anyone in this room, including you and me, a key question to ask ourselves when we want to see significant change happen, when we desire change, and often those are desires birthed in us by God, we have to ask ourselves, or we will, let me think how to phrase this question. Well, to put it as a question, to put it as a fill-in-the-blank statement, if only this could happen, if only I could have that. In South Africa, if you think about the state of this country, if only the state would. If only capital wasn't in the Stellenbosch Mafia, and some of those are here today.
Would the members of the Stellenbosch Mafia please rise?
Or charisma.
Yeah.
A leader who just we could all look to.
Yes.
Just go, that's the man, that's the woman for the hour. So we need to ask ourselves, because these are longings of our hearts. These are where our affections lie. And James says, in very frightening words, you adulterous people. And I think these questions reveal where the affairs of our heart lie. So before we get to more good news, Andy, let's dig a little deeper into the affairs of the heart.
Sure.
And I think it'd be great to hear you talk a bit more about Mammon, the god of Mammon.
Yeah, Mammon, specifically. Well, Jesus says something very interesting. You cannot serve God and then there's actually an interesting fill in the blank there. In many English Bibles, it will say money. But in the Greek of the New Testament, it's just, it's an Aramaic word all of a sudden. It's not a Greek word. All the other words in that sentence, you cannot serve God and, are Greek words. And then comes this word mamun, I guess, which is not Greek. And so what is that thing, mamun? It's an Aramaic word that kind of is connected to financial matters. The early church was pondering this, and they basically asked this question. What kinds of words don't you translate? When you're translating from one language to another, most of the words you turn from, in this case, Aramaic, which Jesus would have been speaking, into Greek. But there's one kind of word you don't translate, and it's names. So Jonathan, if we start speaking French, I'm going to sort of turn it into a Frenchified, Jonathan or something like that. C'est bien, n'est-ce pas? Because names sort of aren't thought of as being translatable. And so the early church decided Jesus was not actually talking about just money, the concept. He was talking about something that had a name, or in a way, a will that had a name, a quasi-personal entity that had a name, which is a demonic entity. And I think of Mammon as the demonic power that attaches itself to money. And and here's how I think of the demonic. It's a will with a whisper. So the thing about the demonic realm is the demons, like the angels, are not embodied. They can't independently act in this material world. And they're not entrusted ultimately with this world in the way human beings are. And they're not fully personal because they've actually rejected personhood. They've rejected relationship. They've rejected dependence and interdependence. So what they're left with is a will and the ability to whisper in the ear of an actual image bearer of God embodied in the world, making choices and pursuing one way or another. And what mammon whispers is, you can have, this is going to sound funny, a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. Now that sounds very neutral, right? That is literally the economic definition of money, a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. But what Mammon says is you can have power that is countable, fungible, and storable. Power that you can count. Money is power that you can count. You can know how much of it you have. Most forms of power, you don't know how much you have. How much power do I have today in this room? I'm not sure. I mean, more than zero, but I don't know how to count it. But I can know how much money I have, so it's countable. It's fungible is just a fancy word for exchangeable. You can trade it for other things. Caesar can only be Caesar in the Roman Empire. He can't suddenly become emperor of Persia. You can't trade power. If you're a founding partner at Third Way Capital, you can't suddenly become a member of the Stellenbosch Mafia, let's say, just by deciding you want to trade today.
They don't want me.
But money is a medium of exchange. You can trade it for something else you want. And in fact, anything you want. And then storable, that's the store of value part, power that you can save for later. You can decide when to use it. You and I have been given power, about half an hour of power here, to shape our imaginations in a room. But then that's over. And we can't say, oh, actually, we're going to do this at 11 a.m. today, or we're going to do it next week. We have to use it now. You have to use power in the moment. But money you can save up and use it some other time. And what Mammon whispers is, wouldn't you like to arrange your whole life around being able to count your power, change it for anything you want, and save it for later? Which is actually an invitation, I think. Now, there's a role for all these functions of money. But that whisper is actually inviting you to step away from the risk of using your power today in the way that you can today, and to start dreaming about a time when you've stored up enough, when you can trade it for whatever life you want. It's basically an invitation to fantasy, and Mammon steps into this useful system of money and distorts our imagination about what we would do if we had enough of it. And I believe it's the most powerful force in our world today. I think it actually exceeds the power of the state. I think that charisma and fame get sort of caught up in the power of Mammon, and I think Mammon is in many ways running the show. It's not that, we say, well, money's neutral, and it's kind of true, but just one more thing about this. There's a really odd thing. Can you serve God and Caesar? Can you serve God and Caesar? Well, Jesus is actually also asked that question. And in the form of the tax, they bring him the denarius. They say, should we pay the tax? He looks at it, he says, whose image is this? And they say, it's Caesar's. And he says, well, give Caesar's what's Caesar's and give God what's God's. Which is basically saying, you serve Caesar with Caesar's stuff and you serve God with God's stuff. Or more precisely, you serve Caesar with the things that have Caesar's image in them, which is his money. Sure, give it back if he wants it. But where is the image of God? It's in people. So you do not render people to Caesar, even though that is in fact what the authorities will do. They will hand over the image bearer of God to Caesar. They'll render him to Caesar in the end. You don't confuse them, but you serve them in their own domains. Now, why would he say that about Caesar, the false god who's oppressing the people of Israel? But then when it comes to money or mammon, he says you can't serve both. You've got to choose between the true God, who every day gives you a way to encounter another person or other persons, and in love respond to them with the power of the Holy Spirit and act in the moment, not fantasizing about the future, not storing it up for another time, but like acting creatively today. Or you will serve this demonic whisper in your ear that says, if you just had more, if you just subordinated personal relationships to your relationship with money, because that's what the demonic always wants you to shift your focus away from persons onto kind of stuff, idols that will secure you. You can't serve both, so you have to choose.
So it's a mechanism that in our world that is perhaps we're most vulnerable to, because we are people who desire solutions that make life work.
Yes, we do.
And this is appears to be one of the most straightforward ways to do so.
It is, but it's always a mirage out on the horizon. Like if we just had enough. And I mean, but you scale it all the way up to billionaires, you know, which I think now, it's so interesting. When I was young, a millionaire was what you ascribed to be. Now we have 1,000x on top of that. And now you are not really, you know, able to make a difference in the world. And you know, there has been some inflation, I admit, but not 1,000 times. And this is how all idols work, is you think, if I just get enough of this, you know, I'll be able to make a difference. And within a single generation or a single lifetime, the amount you need to make a difference, allegedly, is 1,000. But I will tell you, those people who have that level of resources still feel quite like they don't have enough, still are looking for the lever, and you're constantly chasing the lever rather than learning dependence on God, learning the kind of creative power of the Holy Spirit, working in the world you're actually in. All demonic kind of lures you into this world where it'll be different. And we think if we had money, that would, and retrospectively, we tell stories about how it made the difference.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean you can replicate the magic again.
Yeah. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about another, in a sense, idol that we face. So we're going to stay with the bad stuff for a while. I'm going to speak to my days as a management consultant, and even what I do now in Third Way Capital, where in the commercial sector, technology is everything. Yeah. Everything is about a tech-based solution. And if you want to raise money to deploy in Africa, and you're trying to raise it, I don't know, for agriculture, for example, good luck. But if you can raise money for AI in Africa, you might get some. And there's just such a strong sensibility in the West especially, that if you just have, you know, again, if we could just have what X, fill in the blank, if we could just have the right technology, we'll unlock a solution. So I think that, again, reveals something deeper that we're bumping up against, not understanding its power, its demonic power. So do you want to talk to that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so technology and mammon are very closely connected. It is where the money flows. It is how money flows. It is how the wealth of the West, in particular, has been built, and how the rest of the world is modeling the paths to wealth. Technology is built on 3 revolutions: the financial revolution, the industrial revolution, and the computational revolution. Financial revolution took wealth and it moved it from land to money. So wealth used to be in ancient societies, pre-modern societies, almost entirely in the form of land and the productive capacity of land, agriculture. And in the financial revolution, which starts with the Medicis in Venice in the 16th century, value starts to move from land to these financial instruments. And that just has continued and continued until now. Most of our of any wealth that we have is literally just ledger entries, which the Medicis invented in double entry accounting. Then you get the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution work moves from bodies to machines. So all work used to happen at the speed of digestion because human beings and animals that we domesticated would digest food, which we all are doing right now. It produces a certain kind of energy, and then you go out into the world and you work with your bodily energy. And then in the Industrial Revolution, suddenly most work becomes now today done by machines, which have many, many horsepower, you might say. Then you get the Computational Revolution, and in that, knowledge shifts from wisdom to information. So pre-computational revolution, how do you know things? You go to those who are wise. You go to people who have wisdom. But now you go to YouTube. You're like, how do I do this? People used to ask their parents, how do I do this? Kids now do not ask their parents, how do I do this? They ask YouTube, how do I do this, right? What's interesting about these 3 revolutions, this is the stack that on top of it is what we now call modern technology. It is the reason for the GDP hockey stick of the so-called developed world. But what is each of these doing? It's a trade from personal to impersonal power. So when you were working the land, that was usually embedded in family and clan and communal systems that relationships mattered. You had a relationship with the land. When you just have money, money is like the ultimate unrelational value mechanism. It doesn't require, when I go into a shop and I pay, especially with a card, or I just wave my phone at the reader, which is what I do now, the other person, I don't have any relationship with them and I can still get something done. work shifts from bodies, human beings and the animals that they care for, having to have a relationship and get things done. Now the machines do it. That's impersonal power. And then wisdom is personal knowledge, but information is computational, right? So the dream of technology, and it has worked in important ways, is to get things done impersonally, is to get things done without relationship, without interdependence, and just sort of, it kind of happens on its own. And so this is connected to a dream in especially the West that I would call magic, which is instant, effortless, impersonal power. That if I could just instantly get something done, and with no exertion of myself, in fact, we're using a little bit of magic here in these microphones, right? If I were to take away this microphone and have to speak to the whole room, I'd have to exert myself, right? I'd have to put something up, but I can just sit here and just talk very normally if I have a microphone. It's actually better for you all. I think you probably agree. But every time you go for instant, effortless power, you are doing something that eliminates or limits the role of persons. Because people don't operate or change instantly. People don't operate or change effortlessly. And so the dream of technology is we won't have to wait for people and relational systems to grow. We'll just be able to get it done. And we won't have to exert ourselves. We'll just be able to sort of push a button and it'll happen. Now, I think this is very useful in the world of work, and I think much of the wealth that this has generated is genuine common wealth. Things are genuinely better in many areas. If you have a car with an airbag system and you get in an accident, it may well instantly, impersonally, effortlessly save your life, right? So there's a time, and I would say safety is actually the number one thing that technology is really good for, but also scale and production it's good for. What it is not good for is creation. Creating things does not happen instantly, does not happen effortlessly, and does not happen without relationship. And it's not good for formation, becoming the kind of people that we need to be. Because that also doesn't happen at that scale or speed. And the problem is we've let this dream of magic kind of colonize, not just, it's taken over work, which in many ways it relieves human beings of drudgery and it allows us to scale things. I think that's all good. So there's a reason that we should be investing in technology. But when you ask it to substitute for personal relationships, and when you put it into formative context, like the home being the first place where all of us have to learn what it is to become a person. But now we all just get to push buttons and make things happen, or swipe our finger, or watch a screen. And when you put that in the home, it shortcuts and short circuits the process of actually coming to be the human beings we're meant to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, very much so. And I'm thinking back to the initial three gods of Eros,
Mammon, and
Mars. And how even the charismatic leader he or she is not a piece of technology, but they are for us an effortless, low effort solution to the problems rather than anything to do with the actual relationships that make life what it is.
Right. The crazy thing about Jesus, well, there's two crazy things. One is, as important as Augustus Caesar was, and he was important and still affects even in some ways our world, his impact is dwarfed by this person named Yeshua Bar Yosef, rabbi from Nazareth. Like the effect of the life of Jesus over time is far greater than the effect of Augustus Caesar. So that's amazing. But then the equally amazing thing is, for Jesus, it was all about love and dependence. Love of his Father and dependence on his Father, but love of other people and embedding himself in this community of apostles and the women who followed and provided for them, and just being completely committed to a very small group of people. And those that he happened to encounter. And that was enough. Can I say one more thing about Jesus and technology? So there are two primal technologies, money and writing. The first technologies that really give you a kind of instant, effortless, scalable power that we have to wait until we get all the revolutions stacked up to get all the other technologies we have now. But back in the ancient world, there were two things that kind of had this amazing, almost magical quality that we would call technology. Money, which they did have some of. It was mostly in land, but Rome minted money. And then writing is the ability to like get your, well, I wrote a book, and I guess people in South Africa read it because some of you came because you've heard of me maybe, or through media also. So it's a way to like project your presence in a place where you aren't, which is kind of magical. And so these are the two primal technologies. Jesus did not use either one. Again, the money he entrusted Judas, but also writing. He never wrote anything down. Now his followers used money and wrote things down and do. But Jesus himself did not even use the technologies available to him that could have massively scaled his work. Because if you are if you are the image of the invisible God, and you are completely in alignment with what you were made to be, and you have access through prayer and through practicing the presence of your Father in the power of the Holy Spirit, you actually need nothing but yourself to bring about the change in the world that is meant to happen through you. And all this other stuff is ancillary, which is to say it serves us. And it's interesting. So then when the first Christians start to use money, they always send it with people. They keep it relational. Paul is collecting a collection for the poor church in Jerusalem, and he's taking it at great personal risk. He's taking the money himself to Jerusalem. Even more interesting, writing. There was kind of a postal system in the ancient world. You could put a letter on a ship and pay the captain of the ship to make sure it got where it was going. The early church never sent a letter without a person. So Paul writes the letter to the Romans in Corinth and hands it to Phoebe. And Phoebe, we know from Romans 16, is the one carrying it to Rome. So they never decoupled the technology from the personal. They did use the technology in a way that Jesus himself hadn't done, but they never decoupled it from personal relationship.
When, back in my management consulting days, I remember talking with a large construction firm in Canada who, their actual mantra, if you think of a vision statement, this was in 2017, was $1 billion by 2020. That was their mantra.
As in dollars.
As in dollars. $1 billion by 2020. Their mantra was a revenue number.
Wow.
And I remember, and then if you dug in, they're like, how are we going to get there? Through technology. We're getting smart. We're going to be a leader in smart buildings, and we're going to bring in 3D printing and other exponential technologies. And one day I said to the CEO, what does this even? What does any of this even mean? Because at the end of the day, business is by people for people. Yeah. And he sat back and he said, I actually hate the mantra, and I wrote it myself.
Wow.
He said, I want to change the way Canadians experience life and work in the city.
Yes.
So, but the thing is, he lived in a system where all these gods ruled.
Wow.
So Andy, and he wasn't a Christian, but he had this amazing heart, if you really dug in.
Yeah.
Now, there's a whole lot of folk here who have the heart and are Christians and have a relationship with the Father. And yet we are also tempted by all these powers. How do we become people who are not vulnerable to these powers and who act in the world in a way that these powers are no longer the gods that they have set themselves up to be?
Well, I'm sure there's many answers, and it's a renovation of the imagination. And how does that happen? I mean, it's partly through steeping yourself in the story of Jesus and just allowing yourself to be just continually surprised and taken aback and troubled even by how he did things and what he taught. But here's what comes to mind, or what came to mind as you asked that. It's how do we get free of these idols? It's actually by moving towards the brokenness in ourselves and the world, where you will encounter, first of all, you'll encounter the damage the idols have done. Because idols always, off in the distance, the promise is always amazing. The magic is going to be incredible. But you get up close, and they end up really undermining relationship and destroying things. And you move toward the damage, and it causes you to lament and pray. And to say, this has not worked, or it has worked in some ways, but in other ways it's been very harmful, because that's the mixed story of all these things. The state has a role, money has a role, charisma has a role, but it's the distortions that have done so much damage. And you start with your own life, with your own relationships, and you come to a place of brokenness where you're like, this is not working. Oh God, what has happened that I may be responsible for, that others may be responsible for, but that I take responsibility for, at least take responsibility for lamenting it and mourning it and bringing it to you. And somehow then you are starting to practice the humility and dependence that starts to actually unleash the other kind of power in the world. So yeah, it's moving towards the broken. I think that we talk at Praxis about redemptive entrepreneurship in particular, and we distinguish it from ethical, and there's some of this in the booklet. And the difference is ethical business is about being good, which is a good thing and a minimum for Christians. But redemptive business is about moving towards things that have been broken, often by others. And we're not responsible, we didn't do the breaking, but we go to the thing that's broken in an industry, in a sector, or in a nation, and we say, let's figure out how to create there. And that you find you can't solve it with the idols that made the problem in the first place. And so then you start depending on God in a deeper way.
Now, I'm watching the clock. And seeing the time. Can we go over like about 3 minutes or so? Okay, and we are gonna have a Q&A time at 9, as Yuri mentioned. But I just think it's really important to get to a piece in your thinking, Andy, a piece that in a sense is meaningful to me because I feel like God has forced me to learn the things that you talk about. And that is that the very thing that we seek to acquire power. And yet, in the Praxis model, you talk about an I sacrifice, we win model, in which, in a sense, you're relinquishing power.
Right.
And I'd love to hear, folk here to hear more of what you have to say about that.
Sure, and I can do it pretty quickly, but to live it out takes a long time, but to describe it very quick. So, a lot of the world works on the game called I win, you lose. I win at your expense. It's so-called zero-sum game, where if I get more, you get less. And then arises this vision, so that's the exploitative world. The ethical world says, no, I win, you win. We play a game where we both win. And that sounds better, and it is better. The only problem is it only works in already functioning systems. If you live in a neighborhood, or you live, frankly, in a country, or you work in an industry where there's good, well-established rules, rule of law, we might say, or best practices, or generally accepted accounting principles, or whatever, and everybody plays by those rules, you can have win-win encounters, and that's a good thing. What do you do when you're in a system where if you try to play win-win, you're going to end up in lose, I win, you lose, and you're going to lose? Because there's some industries and there's some nations and there's some times in history when it's just not possible to play the win-win game. How do you repair the broken? That's a third way. Now, when you say that, I win, you lose, I win, you win, what's the alternative? What's the third possibility? Most people say, I lose, you win. Would you like to play that game? You're like, I don't want to play the I win, I lose, you win game. And the amazing thing is it's not how it actually works. So at Praxis, we call it I sacrifice, we win. So this was the way of Jesus. To the utmost, it was the way of Jesus. Where in broken settings, if someone will give up grasping what they're trying to win and will empty themselves, and sometimes literally, but sometimes metaphorically, take on the form of a servant, it actually disrupts the system of exploitation in ways that mere ethical action would not. And what it creates, it actually binds people together. When someone voluntarily empties themselves of power, suddenly there's a possibility for us to be reunited and reconciled to each other. And what comes out at the end is not one party loses and the other wins. It's we become a we. So the first two are individual, like you and me, and either we both walk away happy or one of us walks away winning and one losing. But if I sacrifice at the right time in the right way, I bind myself to you such that when the good comes, we are now bound together and we both get it. My sacrifice doesn't end up at my expense. So obviously, ultimate example, Jesus emptied himself all the way to the point of death, now raised above all things so that every knee will bow. But that's not at our expense and it's not at his expense. He's brought us into the story. We're now part of it, but through sacrifice. And we see over and over at Praxis that when people have the courage to sometimes be sacrificial in a business deal, to take terms that you wouldn't maybe have to, if you could extract the maximum benefit, you could get a better term sheet. But you decide, I think here I'm called to make a certain kind of sacrifice. It binds people together. It creates relational possibility. So that's the vision. I sacrifice, but we win.
Amen. Well, I'm going to just wrap this up with a bit. I'm going to put my pastor's hat that I've occasionally worn in my life on and just wrap up with a comment that this life of self-giving, of course, works against every instinct in our being. And that's obviously the instinct of sin at work, to regard oneself first. And the fact is, Paul said, the life I live in this body, I live by the faithfulness of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. And so he has actually made it possible for us to die to ourselves. And when we move into that place of death, we move into the faithfulness of God. And we move into we move into the space of the one who, unlike Caesar, has changed the world over the course of 2,000 years in a way that Caesar never could have. So, Andy, let's stop there. We'll have Q&A later on and continue the conversation. Everybody else, thank you so much. Andy, thank you.
Well, thank you.